Hey, hey.
Hey, how's it going?
It's going good. How are you?
I'm doing well. It's kind of early in the morning here for me, which is great.
Yeah.
Got the kids off to school and yeah.
Excellent.
So I think last time we spoke it was evening for me, which now you get the early morning version of Brian.
Yeah. Are you a morning person?
I tend to be yeah, I wouldn't say that I fully embrace being a morning person, but I certainly enjoy the mornings. So yeah.
Awesome. Most people that have kids tend not to have a choice really at this point.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah, I think having kids too, you have you know, the time in the evening is really precious. Once the
Yeah.
kids are in bed, you're like, okay, now I have some time to focus and work on things. So yeah, that's
Yeah.
certainly
If you
you
can
find
stay
yourself
awake.
staying up later than you want to, at least in my case. So yeah,
Yeah. Well, that's my woes is I stay up too late and then I have to wake up
yeah,
so late. So, but yeah, working with Americans. I
yeah.
think last time we talked, I probably stayed up to like 2 or 3 in the morning chatting with
Oh
you.
yeah, sure.
So.
Yeah,
But that's my default. So it's really nice when the time zones allow and people's schedules. I guess you have a bit more
hmm,
flexibility
yeah.
with how you do your hours and stuff. But a lot of people are working 9 to 5 and they live on the west coast of the States. That's 8 hour difference. And then it's like, could you start at 1 a.m., Phil? And I'm like, I guess so, yeah. So this is
Yeah,
always nice having a three in the afternoon conversation
yeah, for
is
sure.
perfect.
Yeah, it works great for me too. I certainly after a day of working with clients, my mental capacity is somewhat diminished and
Yeah,
emotional capacity. So yeah, for
I
sure.
I hear you. I hear you.
So I
There's
wanted
a
just to check in with you briefly. And I don't know if this is the first podcast that you're doing since you took a little bit of a break. Or okay, second.
second one.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So I guess I didn't hear all the information about what was going on with your health, and so I just wanted to check in to see how you're
There's
doing.
a lot of information and none of it is particularly bringing us much closer to a diagnosis of what
Mm,
actually happened or what was going on. So
okay.
I mean, I'm intrigued. I actually have some ponderings as to whether actually some of it might be quite trauma based actually.
Sure. Yeah.
And so yeah, not to hijack the podcast and turn it into a therapeutic session or anything,
Oh yeah,
but
not at all.
I just am really intrigued. So I was listening to a podcast recently with Pete Holmes' podcast. I don't know if you're familiar with it. His
Yeah, for sure.
wife Val
Hmm.
Cheney, she was mentioning a couple of years ago she had loads of chest issues, and they were doing
Yeah.
scans on her heart and her lungs, and they were really like, "What's going on?" And they couldn't find anything,
Yeah.
and she ended up finding out that it was actually very trauma based and there was a
Sure.
whole bunch of
Yeah.
stuff from her childhood and she's been working
Yeah.
through that, and that was that, and it just got me thinking. I was like, man, I have gone through a lot of scans
Mm,
and tests and they're
yeah.
going, you're in pretty great shape. Maybe your
Yeah.
cholesterol's a bit
Yeah.
high or this or but like
Hmm.
there's nothing that would be causing this
Yeah.
constant
Sure.
so yeah, so but I mean, I don't know. I mean,
Yeah.
and this could be something we talk about maybe, but like it fascinates me with trauma. Like trauma seems to be one of those things that suddenly people go, holy crap, I've got trauma.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
and we tend to kind of like repress that on some level, be
Hmm.
unaware of it.
Right.
It sneaks up on us a lot of the
Yeah.
time. And so, yeah, so I've just been wondering, gosh, have I got some stuff? Because it happened while I was taking actually 2 weeks off, which I never do over
Mm,
Christmas. That's when it
yeah.
kind of rose up. And
Yeah.
I was like, oh, I've kind of stopped. I'm taking some time off. My body's going, hey, now's maybe a good time to start
Mhm.
screaming.
Yeah, for
I don't
sure.
know. So
Yeah.
it's intriguing. So maybe that's kind of what I'm thinking. But I have actually been about the last week or so. I've been seeing the symptoms lessen in their persistency and
Hmm.
their
Yeah.
intensity.
Yeah.
And so that's been good. And I could maybe tie that to some practices, but the whole
Yeah.
time I've been trying to be really good with meditation, with
Sure.
doing all kinds of different practices.
Yeah.
So yeah, it wasn't stress related. They kind of tested that to the nth degree and said it's
Okay.
definitely not like
Yeah.
stress. And so
Mm.
what happened, Brian? I don't know. What is
Yeah,
happening?
for
I don't
sure.
know. But I'm working with the tension of like they've still got more tests to do. They're
Yeah.
taking off a lot of things that make me feel better
Mhm.
because I'm apparently a lot
Right.
healthier than I thought I was. I actually
Yeah.
assumed half of this stuff would be bad anyway.
Totally.
Um,
Yeah, for
so
sure.
yeah, it's a bit of a weird one, but I'm trying to take it a bit easier. And I've gone down to one podcast
Yeah.
a week,
Mhm.
and we'll just see where we go. And I'm doing things like
Yeah.
Q&As as well. So I'm gonna let you do all the talking today, and I'm just gonna
Okay.
sit and
Yeah.
watch. So,
Yeah, that works.
but
It,
yeah,
yeah. Interestingly enough, over the holidays, actually Christmas Day, I had been having some heart kind of, you know, elevated heart rate. At resting heart rate was spiking occasionally. thought maybe AFib or something. And on Christmas Day, I had a similar experience of like,
Wow.
I'm not okay. Something's going on here. And got a heart monitor for, a few days to just double check and see how things were going. And in the same cases as yours, most of my numbers look good. Things seem okay. When it comes to trauma and how that impacts our bodies, based on the, adverse childhood experiences, research, and just what we're learning about trauma, it can show up in so many different ways physically. And so, yeah, I'm right there with you, kind of middle-aged, human trying to sort out, what's going on with my body. And we can't always point to something specific, which makes it frustrating. Chronic pain, irritable bowel, like there's so many things that it's hard to point to the specific cause of that. But looking at it through the lens of the nervous system and the demands that's been placed on our system over time, we're recognizing more and more that it's having an impact. And then how to treat that, it's like, again, doing lots of different practices, trying to find what works for your body, tuning into it a bit more. And so I'm certainly on a similar journey with you as well. And I suspect folks who are listening to this podcast are also, may have experiences like what we're describing, where there's nothing, kind of obvious cause, but there's something that's not okay. The body's kind of, out of balance.
Yeah. And like, gosh, if there's ever a time where a lot of us are slower right now. We've had to stay at home. We're not traveling as much. We're not working as much. Some of us have got to quit or have lost jobs, and there's lots of things. And then all of that can be stressful. The pandemic is stressful. And then everyone's got their different religious or spiritual journeys as well, which is, of course, a whole host of different stuff. It does feel like we're in a bit of a whirlwind for this stuff to kind of arise, if it's going to arise. But yeah.
I want to share just a little bit about that context. Early on during the pandemic, there was this meme that kind of was just everywhere, kind of comparing the pandemic to, what your, ancestors did, during the war or something like World War II. I think the meme said something to the effect of, your ancestors were asked to go to war and fight for their country, and you're just being asked to sit on your couch and watch Netflix and not go out in public, as if that was just a simple, easy thing to do. And in looking at it through the lens of trauma, I actually responded to that meme with a version of my own that your ancestors or your relatives were asked to engage in a fight or flight response and to be actively engaged in a collective, we're in this together kind of experience. And you're being asked to kind of exist in a freeze collapse response, to feel powerless. And I've, I'm working with folks who, who are frontline workers, as well as folks who are, holed up in their house. And it's really interesting to see different forms of stress as a result of that, different, responses to that event. And in some ways that feeling powerless or trapped or stuck is more difficult for a nervous system, or equally difficult or difficult in a different way. And so I think it's just so helpful for us to think about life through this trauma lens. Because what seems on the face of it, like, it would be simple to stay home and watch Netflix. When you feel like I'm not able to move as freely in the world, when it feels like there's a threat that's outside and it's just kind of ever present, and there's nothing I can do about it. There's nothing to push against or to fight against. And obviously, doing the physical distancing and, taking those kinds of steps are really important. And we can feel a bit engaged in that. But I don't think that translates to our nervous system in the same way that there's a threat directly in front of me and I'm going to physically do something to escape to safety or defend myself. And that certainly is a difficult, experience for our nervous system.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you think about a lot of my understanding of all kinds of trauma and adverse kind of experiences is you have these cycles that need to be closed off, generally speaking. And so you have this huge blast of endorphins and hormones and everything. And then someone breaks into your house But then you hit him over the head with the frying pan, and the police come and arrest him and take him away. And there's kind of like this, okay, it's all sorted, it's concluded, I'm safe. And your body tells you you're safe. And there's a well done for telling me I was unsafe. And, all these things kind of come. But there is a thing of like constantly watching the news 24/7, being told you're not safe, you're not safe, you're not safe, and going, okay, so what can I do? Nothing really. Like, staying home. Don't go shopping more than you need to. Don't go hang out with your friend. Okay, so I can do these things, but I'm not I'm not getting I see the guy lying on the floor unconscious and the police taking him away. I'm not seeing the tangible conclusion that would start sending safety signals to kind of counteract those danger signals or close the loop in a sense. That's terrifying to live in that really constant.
And I think at the heart of trauma is there's an unresolved quality to it. And I just, to underline what you just shared, when you move into a survival response, whether it's a fight or flight response or even a freeze collapse response, that's meant to be a temporary experience. And then our body has the experience of moving through that if I went to a freeze collapse response and I move into an activated fight or flight response, and I feel the power of kind of like doing what needs to be done, saying what needs to be said, resolving that, and then moving into a more kind of safe and social and connected physiology. And so when we aren't given the opportunity to kind of resolve that, and and resolving that doesn't have to be directly confronting the real or perceived threat, but somehow giving your nervous system approximating a resolution of that or completion of that. It's just so important, because otherwise that hangs out in our nervous system as I'm still not okay. I'm still powerless. I'm still hypervigilant. I'm still on edge. I'm still like not safe. And so I think as you're describing this, being bombarded with all this information and these messages that are not just things our mind is processing, but are impacting how we physically feel in the world, without some ability to move through that, we just kind of begin to get stuck there. And I think I know our conversation today is about religious trauma, which I see very much through the lens of trauma, not. I think sometimes we talk about religious trauma as, maybe connected to deconstruction or leaving one's religion. And that certainly can be a traumatizing event for many folks. But we're not talking just about, anxiety or depression or maybe adjustment disorder or maybe, complex grief or loss around some of those experiences. But, looking at it through the lens of trauma and the nervous system, it's harder to kind of pinpoint what was traumatizing about that. And I think some of the questions that your viewers had, submitted, were asking about that. How do we know it's religious trauma? What does this look like? It wasn't so bad in my church, but it didn't feel safe and okay. And and to be able to identify that as trauma can be really difficult, because there was no intruder. There was no, obvious physical thing that I experienced. And I think obvious is the key word here. Your body was experiencing various, incomplete survival responses. But, you maybe weren't aware of that, didn't have the concept of what that was like, weren't paying attention to your body to notice what that was like. And so you're left kind of, asking a fish, what is water, and like, what does it feel like? What is the experience of water? And the fish responds, what is water? Like, I have this is just what it's like to be a fish. This is just what it's like to have gone to the kind of church that I attended. This was just what it was like to live in my family. And it does make it more difficult to kind of identify that, to feel like that's something that I actually experienced.
There's a component in me, and this might be really ignorant because I don't know a lot, but part of me has noticed and people that are deconstructing are obviously, generally speaking, they're looking back at their tradition, their faith, and asking questions and evaluating it and questioning it. And And it does feel like, in a sense, trauma is a big buzzword right now. And I know that you yourself have said that often we use the word trauma when probably we should be using things like maybe more adverse kind of, I can't remember what you said actually, what word you used. Was it adverse?
So we talk about, adverse childhood experiences there's a lot of research around that, but then we've introduced the concept of adverse religious experiences, right, to kind of capture these events that may not result to trauma, but are creating conditions where trauma is more likely. If we think about trauma as this mismatch between our internal and external resources that we have access to, and the demand placed on our system. And so we could have, high demand and high, resources, and that may not result in trauma. We could have, moderate or low demand placed in our system, but very little or no resources, and that can result in trauma. And so, I think, noticing that, trauma is difficult to define for that very reason.
Right.
And we started out, defining trauma as existing in the event. If you experience an event that had these characteristics, these qualities were sustained over this amount of time, then we can say, well, then that was traumatic. But then we realize, well, some folks experienced those same events and it wasn't traumatizing. Right. So like, what's up? Where does the trauma exist? And if we think about trauma as existing in that physiological response to the event, and in such a way that has this, kind of post traumatic stress, this ongoing impact, then we have to be interested and concerned with, who is this nervous system experiencing the event? What's the context surrounding that? And then that just gives us a lot more understanding of, what are the component factors that lead to trauma. And, I'm super interested in studying that a bit more, and, learning about, what about various doctrines, what about various religious structures, beliefs, practices that tend to result in trauma. And again, I think it's important to point out that these are conditions that can lead to trauma, because a lot of, believers, folks who are committed to defending their religious faith and beliefs will say, well, it wasn't traumatizing to me. And that can be completely true. The same event experienced by a group of people will have very different responses. They'll have very different responses to that based upon the factors we just talked about.
Yeah. No, this is huge to me because it is a deeply subjective reality. Like you're saying, someone can believe in hell and that gives them peace and that gives them safety and that gives them comfort and security. And then someone else can be taught the same sort of thing and they can live in terror for decades. And it's intriguing to me because I do see a tendency right now with a lot of people just saying, well, that teaching is traumatic. If you were taught that, you've been traumatized. And I don't know if we're maybe on some level actually minimizing the trauma of some people, but also we're maybe setting ourselves up for a bit of failure, trying to, trying to almost traumatize ourselves by going, I was taught that, like, where's the trauma? How can I root out some, how did that psychologically damage me? Where maybe some of the things just didn't hit you in that way. You were in the right place at the right time with the right framework that didn't impact you in a certain way. I'm just intrigued by that concept. And do you think that there needs to be maybe, what do you think about the current focus on trauma in this kind of space? I know you're kind of familiar with the space. It's not your speciality and only focus, but you're very familiar with a lot of people in this space. I mean, loads of people are doing podcasts on the most traumatic teachings and this and that. Do you think that's helpful, not helpful, a bit of both? So
I guess the way I would conceptualize that is, I think it's always helpful to have a deeper understanding of, spiritual abuse, religious abuse. When I think about some of these doctrines that tend to be, demanding on a person's nervous system. Not universally demanding, not for everyone, but they tend to have this impact. You know, they're limiting a person's choice. They're limiting a person's internal sense of power and control. We just know that has a high potential of creating conditions where trauma can be experienced. And so, you know, I think pointing out, you know, here's these toxic doctrines or beliefs or ideas or practices, I think there's value in that. However, pinning the trauma onto that experience itself, I think, does a disservice to our understanding of trauma and to survivors. Because what you can have is folks like you just mentioned. You know, I grew up in the same church. I heard these same teachings about hell, and you know, should I be traumatized? And so there's that kind of like, I'm not sure. Like, people are saying this was traumatizing, and to not kind of look at that through the lens of the individual nervous system, we begin to make these kind of, you know, broad generalizations that I think are helpful from an advocacy and an awareness perspective. Let's talk about, you know, the cost benefit analysis of the doctrine of hell, right? Like, okay, it helps groups stay together. It keeps people in line. You know, shame is a powerful motivator, you know, to keep groups together. And we can see maybe some adaptive evolutionary function from a group dynamic standpoint. But we also want to recognize that, yeah, that can be harmful to individuals. And so to look at that through that lens, I think is helpful in raising awareness. However, if we're not adding the component of here's why one person's nervous system may experience that as trauma and another may not. What are the protective factors that can contribute to a person not experiencing that as trauma? You'll see this a lot in, you know, American evangelicalism, where, you know, being a white, you know, cishet male, you have just massive amounts of power, and you know, there are protective factors, as it were, that come at a cost to other individuals who don't have access to those. And so the folks who are in leadership, the folks who, you know, may not be experiencing religious trauma at the same rate or to the same degree as folks who don't have access to as much, you know, internal resources, external resources. And I think it's just really important to point that out, because then, you know, you mentioned that, you know, trauma is subjective, and that's certainly true. I think what happens, though, especially with folks from a fundamentalist background, there is no subjective.
Right.
It's all objective. It's true or it's false. And if you say, I didn't experience this as trauma, therefore no one else should experience this as trauma, you're kind of dismissing another person's experience. I also want to add that, you know, while the experience of trauma might be subjective in that it varies from person to person and based on these factors we're talking about, but there's an objective quality to it as well. And I think that's where, you know, to answer some of the questions around, you know, how do I know that I have trauma? It's not simply like, well, I think I have trauma, or, just feeling like they have to, a person has to defend, you know, why what they're experiencing is trauma. We can say, no, like, if we notice your nervous system's response, your reaction to this, there's an objective quality to that. You know, if I am feeling unsafe in the world, if someone, you know, touches my shoulder and I jump, you know, like, yeah, like that's an autonomic nervous system response that's likely tied to an earlier, you know, traumatic event. And so I think sometimes we talk about trauma as being subjective. People are like, well, it doesn't actually exist, or it's just like this person, you know, can't handle stress, or there's something, you know, broken or wrong with them. And I think that's certainly communicating an unhelpful message about, you know, trauma being subjective. Like, there are very objective kinds of things that we can observe about a person's nervous system that indicates they've experienced trauma. We're not, you know, people aren't just making this up, you know. Right. I think it's important to point that out as well.
Yeah, I mean, this is an extensively studied topic. Right now, it's a huge topic within psychology, right? I mean, it's a massive area of research, and there's more and more data coming out. It's not that And it is a soft science. It is something where we're not observing the outside of the brain, oh yeah, it's squishy, it looks like a grapefruit. No, we're diving into we have to talk to people, we have to get into the mix of it. But there's a lot of data out there. I think, there's no question about that. For people like you and I that are maybe willing to explore that maybe don't have as much of an agenda or maybe our own inner world to protect so we avoid any trauma. But there is that component, like you said, that you talk to an evangelical, you talk to someone that is maybe more conservative, more fundamental in their faith. They are not going to like the idea that it's not just what works for them. This is what is an eternal, timeless truth. So it's not just this works for me. This is the Bible told me because God told us that there is a hell and this is what it looks like and you're going to go there if you do X and you're not going to go there if you do Y. Like, trying to communicate to someone like that. There was a great question in there. I've got a list of questions here and it just feels like a sea of
we
text.
can just kind of jump around.
But one of them that came out that I thought was a brilliant question is, how do you go about talking about this? Because, this is something, if I was diagnosed with depression, I would want to be able to talk to my family, my friends and say, hey, I've got depression. This is how it affects me. This is what it looks like. This is kind of what I need from you. I'm doing my best to work on this, but I need all the help I can get around me. And most of my friends in this day and age, even very fundamental Christians, would probably have some level of sympathy, some level of understanding. We all understand depression. Maybe some extreme Christians would be like, well, the joy of the Lord is your strength and you shouldn't have depression. Or maybe, but I think a lot more are becoming more open to mental health issues on some level. But when you talk about, hey, I've got religious trauma, what I'm saying to that evangelical is, hey, you are wrong. That's what they're hearing. And they're going, and your God is wrong, and your religion is wrong, and Christianity is wrong. And so how do we even begin going about, because I know you have clients that you work with, and I'm sure many of them have religious family, religious friends. And they don't want to just go, well, I guess I never talk to any of them ever again. But of course, these people are probably the most triggering of people to be around as far as offsetting your trauma and going back and living in that world. How do you encourage people to navigate that?
Yeah, I'm so glad to hear this question because it kind of ties into what we were talking about just moments ago, where if trauma exists in the event itself, then we're having a conversation about, is the doctrine of hell traumatizing or not? And so I think how do I talk to believing friends and family about religious trauma? I think the place to begin is to talk about religious trauma as trauma. If you were to talk, to use your example about depression, if you were to say, I'm experiencing depression and these are the resources that I need, this is what's going on in my life. That's a very different conversation than saying, this relationship caused my depression, because now we're having a conversation about, you're wrong and why did you do this to me? And here it's a very different conversation. And I think that's where bringing a more trauma-informed approach to how we talk about religious trauma, not as religious abuse. There's a place for that conversation. I want to have that conversation collectively as a society, within religious communities, outside of religious communities. That's a really important conversation to have. However, when we conflate that with religious trauma, when we conflate religious abuse with religious trauma, when you're talking to believing friends and family and you're saying, the church was abusive to me, that might be true. If what you're trying to gain in that conversation is a deeper understanding of how I'm being impacted by that day to day, that's a very different conversation. That's not inviting friends and family to dismiss your experience, because again, you're centering, this is my experience, this is how my nervous system is responding to that. And I think you could even say something to the effect of, whether or not, hell is a real place. My body is experiencing those teachings this way. Whether or not you think that the way the pastor treated me was traumatizing, or if I should just get over it. Whether or not we come to any agreement on what was inherent in that experience, this is how it's affecting me. And so I would, again, I think I would encourage folks to begin from a place of, let's talk about trauma as trauma, as opposed to let's talk about religious trauma as religious abuse. Again, there's a place for that conversation. but talking about and trying to help another person understand your experience of trauma, that's probably not the place to talk about that just solely through the lens of abuse.
Yeah.
Once a person begins to understand, like, and can begin to validate and accept that, your experience is your experience, and here's how your body is responding in these autonomic ways that you don't have full control over, then, like you mentioned, hopefully folks will be compassionate and have some understanding. It still invites them to, think about their beliefs differently, or to maybe challenge some of their assumptions about the world. And that can be difficult for them, but that's not the point of that conversation, right? It's not to say, I want to help you begin your deconstruction journey against your will because, I need you to better understand my trauma. Even if, and I think this was part of another question, even if a person's religious experience was a mix of care and support and connection and abuse and neglect and harm or disconnection, one person, a believing friend or family, might be like, yeah, like I've really enjoyed all the positive experiences connected with church, and it might be difficult for them to recognize the more challenging or harmful components of that. Speaking about that through the lens of your personal experience, with a focus on, this is how my body's responding to that, as opposed to, this is true or false or right or wrong. I think that at least it creates a context in which that conversation can happen. There's no guarantee. But I think it gives you the best chance of getting some buy-in to your experience without, requiring a person to have their own deconstruction before they can understand you.
Yeah. It's such a complex thing, talking with people that in many ways are just at a totally different stage of life in how they see the world and what they need from the world as well. It requires, it feels so unfair. I talk about this a lot, but it feels so unfair that those who are on the out, those who are suffering, those who are in pain, have to take this higher ground and a higher road and go, okay, I know that I am perfectly justified to turn around and look at this abusive system or these people that have hurt me or whatever and go, screw you guys, you're the worst, whatever. And of course, things are much more complex. People aren't intentionally abusive and, and all these things most of the time. But it seems so unfair when I'm in the midst of pain. I'm the one who's experiencing trauma. I have to now educate my family on trauma. I have to, take the higher ground and go, oh gosh, what would make them feel unsafe in this conversation? Oh, if I worded it that way, that would scare them. Maybe I could word it this way. Like, it feels so unfair, but the truth is, of those two parties, only one of those two parties is capable of taking that line of communication. So it's really tough. So I don't want people to hear like something like that and go, oh, it's really unfair, you're putting it onto me, because the truth is, you don't have to do that. It's just, if you want to have this conversation, you probably are going to have to be the person that does that.
I certainly want to underline what you just said there as well. It's not a survivor's responsibility to educate, folks who, were actively engaged in the abuse that caused that, or those who are complicit in that, or even just, someone who wasn't connected at all. It's not your job to educate them. However, if your goal is to gain a bit more understanding there, then there are more effective and less effective ways of approaching that. And so, I certainly want to make that clear as well. And I think another thing I want to point out here, I think is also important. If you feel like you're needing to explain your experience to someone who is incapable or unwilling to hear you, that might be more of a please or please kind of response. Like, how can I need you to accept me so that I can feel safe. And there's something, kind of disempowering about that. If my safety is connected to your acceptance,
right,
then I need to really work hard at gaining your acceptance. And that can be done in a way that is disempowering and feels more like a survival response, And so, while having a conversation to help another person gain deeper understanding of your experience might be helpful, it could also be equally helpful or even more helpful to have the conversation of, no, I don't accept what you're saying. I'm pushing you away. I'm saying like, no, you don't get to treat me this way. You don't get to tell me, God has it all figured out and it'll be better in the end. Like I'm rejecting that. I'm pushing that away as a way of getting out of that please and appease response, as a way of saying, I can be strong enough, powerful enough to do what I need to say and do in order to feel safer in the world. And so, I think, obviously there's a lot of nuance and every situation is unique.
Of course.
And so, I really appreciate, as we're talking, I find both of us, adding some additional information to the conversation that's like, results may vary. This is maybe something to consider, but there's more than one way to approach that.
Sure. Yeah. And I didn't on any level hear you saying that, the victim had to educate her. But I'm just like, this is my mind. When I'm here, I'm going, gosh, this is so unfair. Like, this isn't just, I'm in this place. But the truth is, if we want to have that conversation with someone that's in such a lockdown place, they don't have the depth and comprehensive kind of communication and exploratory worldviews to have that kind of conversation. It does require someone else to take the initiative on some level, which is very painful. And so I guess it brings me to another component of this question. I think it was a question leading on from it, where someone was asking, so if they are trying to have a conversation with friends and family, evangelicals, things like that, obviously, there's ways that this can go better or worse. It's very rarely going to be easy. It's going to be a tough conversation. But on the spectrum, there is probably a window in that spectrum where it is just not going well at all. It is bad. It is bad. And bad would probably be an understatement as far as how it's experienced, right? It's crying, yelling, screaming, disowning, who knows,
Sure.
And certainly in the mix of that, there is invalidation of how they feel. There's gaslighting. There's all kinds of stuff. Again, not really as any commentary on the person that's been traumatized or trying to have this conversation, more as a commentary of the person's fragility, the fear of their religion, their existential world kind of crumbling if they even go into this. What do you suggest? Is there a sort of a line here where you do draw a line? You kind of talk there about maybe creating some boundaries and going, hey, no, that's not okay. Is there a point where you kind of look at a communication that's happening with friends and family and go, this is just not going to go well, and I need to take a step back. I need to exit. I need to create boundaries. I need to end relationships. Do you have some kind of key points that you're like, this is just a big red flag, take a step back?
Yeah. So I think, and I didn't offer this disclaimer earlier on in our conversation, so I'll offer it here. Anything that I'm sharing is for kind of educational purposes. It's not meant to replace, the knowledge and experience of your own personal physician and mental health provider. And so, when you ask me this question, I think that the thing that comes to mind is to talk about principles around that. So that a person can more easily adapt that to their own unique experience. And so what would be required in this particular context in order for that conversation to be a useful, helpful conversation? And so if we were to think about that through the lens of the nervous system, we might imagine someone is pushing against us in a way that isn't safe for us. Maybe we're pushed up against the wall. And if you were to do this movement, and for those who are listening, my hands are kind of pulled back to my shoulders, and there's this kind of like I'm kind of pulling away. And if you were to put your hands, up to your shoulders like this, palms facing out, you might notice it's harder to breathe here. I can't take a deep breath. My body's moving into this kind of response where I can, breathe at this very shallow top of my lungs kind of place, but I can't take a deep breath because I don't feel safe enough here. If I wanted to be open and curious and understanding and compassionate about another human in this place, I wouldn't be able to do that effectively. What I could do here, I'm an empathetic, compassionate person. There's a part of me cognitively, rationally, mentally that says this bully is behaving in this way because of various factors in their life. It's their unresolved trauma, something that they've gone through. What was their family life like? I want to be open and curious and compassionate. But when I do that in this freeze collapse place, what that translates to in my body is I feel more powerless. Now, my compassion for this person, my trying to be understanding of their experience is preventing me from doing what's necessary for my nervous system to feel safe and okay. Yeah. And so what compassion looks like in a freeze collapse state is often more freeze collapse, more feeling disempowered. And so if we were to think about in this physiological state, is a context in which I can have a conversation that's safe and okay for me, and the likelihood is that's going to be very difficult. Your nervous system won't really allow you to do that. Now, if we were to take our hands from this position by our shoulders, palms out, and push in this kind of middle place, we might imagine what is it like to like finally go like no, and we're like this aggressive and forceful and powerful pushing kind of place here. And that might be, saying something that needs to be said, physically doing something, moving away. This could be escaping to safety. It could be more of a flight response. But we're moving into this more activated response. Now, what I notice in my body is all of a sudden there's this, like here goes. Like there's a quick in-breath, a quick out-breath. My heart's racing a bit. I'm feeling this aggression, this power, this like survival energy to do something. And this is this mobilizing kind of energy. If we were to ask that same question here in this kind of middle place as we're pushing, and we say, can I be open and curious and compassionate about this other person in this place? Again, it's going to be difficult to do that because inside of a fight or flight response, our body's focused on, the exit. It's focused on the threat. It's focused on doing what's necessary. And so that's going to be a context in which that conversation won't be super helpful or possible even. If we were to push all the way out and here's, my arms fully extended, like, no. And here's the boundary. Here's the, like, you will not treat me this way. We are not having that conversation. I will not accept your Bible verses in response to my suffering. I'm noticing that, this is that I've, hit the intruder over the head with a pan and now, they're neutralized. They're no longer a threat to me. My body can begin to come down to a place of, I'm okay enough. If the bully is no longer pushing against me in this freeze collapse kind of place, I'm not in the please appease response. If I'm not actively, but the Bible says this, but no, this is my experience. But did you read this book? And this is the kind of back and forth. This is the kind of arguing, kind of fighting state. I'm not able to have much of a conversation there. But if I'm able to prioritize my need for safety first, if I can do what's necessary for myself to feel safer, stronger, more okay. Now, being curious about what is it about? What does religion do for them that it didn't do for me? Might it be possible that, they're not experiencing that in an adversive, harmful way, but maybe that's actually working for them at some level. It doesn't work for me, but it's working for them. Yeah. I can have that openness, curiosity, compassion from a place of safety. And so I think when we're looking at this question of, how do we communicate with our family members, if we start from a foundation of safety and do what's necessary to gain that safety, which might be the initial conversations are, no, I'm not talking to you about this. Pushing back, doing what needs to be done, saying what needs to be said, and also connecting with other supportive, nurturing, attuned nervous systems, outside of that relationship where you can begin to trust yourself a bit more, feel a bit more embodied, a bit more empowered. Now we're creating a context in which that conversation is possible. We're not saying it's necessary. We're not saying it's required. We're not saying that it's even going to go well, but we're saying it's possible in a way that is not possible in freeze collapse or in a fight or flight response. And so I think, hopefully listeners who are hearing that description can apply those principles to their own experience. And that will look very different for each person. Yeah. Right? Yeah. What those boundaries are, how strong those boundaries are. Moving from a place of, I need other people to be okay in order for me to be okay, from a very pleasing, appeasing place, which is the lived experience of so many people in high demand groups. Moving from that to a sense of, I got this, I can trust myself. No one gets to tell me about me. And in this more embodied sense of safety and strength and power, that journey is not an easy journey. There's certainly no a switch to flip that you just go from, this external source of survival to an internal source of safety. Like it's not, but I think not putting too much pressure on yourself. I think sometimes, folks who aren't familiar with trauma are like, well, just tell me what happened, like what's going on? Why is this so difficult for you? Mm-hmm. And they're not prioritizing the person's need for safety first.
Yeah.
I don't want to have a conversation with a client about the details of their trauma early on. I don't want to, kind of push or pry or try to, go beyond their kind of internal capacity, because I know that can be re-traumatizing.
Yeah.
And so, and I don't want survivors to intentionally, or I guess unintentionally, I don't think anyone would intentionally do this, but they may feel like they need to have that conversation before they're ready. Yeah. And so there can be that kind of urgency, that pushing, that like, I need to, to respond and to say, no, I'm not going to respond. I'm not having this conversation now, can be incredibly powerful.
Yeah. Wow. That's brilliant. It's very, very helpful. I found in just trying to gauge, I've done this without really consciously thinking through doing those steps, I guess, but just closing my eyes, getting myself in a place where I put my hands on my heart, and just think, and then I think through the conversation I have to have. Maybe it's someone at church that I was terrified of talking to because I was trying to leave, but I needed their approval. And I just think, okay, let's go to their house and have that conversation. And immediately I'm like, and I'm like, okay, that's not a good place to have that conversation. What if we had it at a coffee shop? Oh, no. Oh, what if my friend Bob was there as well? Oh, that feels a bit easier. And just almost visualizing myself through the options. So I guess that's what I was doing on some level, is kind of just trying to figure out, okay, where do I feel? Oh, there's the space. My arms are all the way out at this point. Oh, maybe that's how I start to explore this.
When we think about, I mean, what you're describing there is it's another really great component to this. It's this combination of internal and external resources, in contrast to the demand that would place on your system, and to say, how can I change the environment? What form do I want this conversation to take? Sometimes a face-to-face conversation is what is going to feel strongest and most powerful to you. Often an email conversation, like this will be in writing. When you reply, I can take a moment and decide when I want to read the reply. I'm not in this, immediate kind of threat response. And so, to think about the context, how do I want to do that? And as you're describing, kind of visualizing that, I would say you were kind of embodying that as well. Because it wasn't just this kind of like, well, let me just imagine these two different scenarios, and like, what do I cognitively think about that? You're like, no, my body's like, no, don't go to that house. You
quickly feel the sinking in your gut, the tightness in your chest, whatever it is.
So I think, definitely, prioritizing your safety, your strength, your power inside of that context as well. Another piece I would add to that is practice saying no. Practice saying no in easier contexts, decline an offer for an upsell or something that you're not interested in buying at the store, or, saying no with as few words as possible, saying no without justifying why you're saying no. Our ability to, be okay in those difficult conversations often is quite dependent upon, how much power do I have? And if I can't say no in a way that's forceful and strong, and I don't feel like I have to explain or rationalize or justify my no, but I'm like, nope, we're done. And just being with that discomfort, but also feeling the strength and power of that. Like, I don't need to make this other person understand me right now. I don't need to rescue them. If I'm saying church was harmful for me, and here's how, and here's the lasting impacts on my own life, and a person is like, whew, that's really upsetting to me. Like, I can't believe this happened to you. And all of a sudden, you, as the survivor, you're being invited to comfort or soothe or make it okay for them. And I want to encourage survivors that's not your job. That's their work to do. We're not intentionally trying to inflict harm, and if we see that that's happening, we want maybe take a step back or not push any further. But in the same way that you're prioritizing your safety, they're able to prioritize their safety as well, and they can push away and say, I'm not having this conversation anymore, and we can respect that.
It's really tough. Like, I mean, it's tough talking about these things to people that are open. and people that are
Yes.
welcoming to start to have these conversations, to start to be a bit more vulnerable, to go into things that we don't want to explore and relive, really particularly. We spend most of our time trying to trap these and push them down, not open up a conversation. So to do that with someone that maybe isn't safe. And I think you hit a good point as well, where people often are so driven by this need to fit in, to appease, to please, that maybe they have those conversations a bit early. You know, what I've noticed, so the stage of deconstruction generally happens when we look at ego development theory or other developmental theories. We look at people go from this prior stage, which most people who are very conventional Christians are at this stage where they primarily feel safe in a certain group that keeps them secure and safe, and there's a belonging, and this is who we are. But in that, they give up a lot of their own autonomy. And actually, that's why a lot of things that might be very harmful for an individual aren't so harmful, because they're giving that up. They're giving up that side of them to belong. And the next stage of development is you become a lot more autonomous. You become a lot more individually driven. You want to build yourself and develop yourself and evaluate how you need to grow and develop. And in that, you start looking and going, holy crap, there's trauma in here, there's abuse, there's whatever, and you start dealing with it. But you don't just go from one to the other. And so what I found is a lot of people that are shifting and start to discover, oh my gosh, I've got some trauma, or oh my gosh, I've got some stuff I need to address with my family, or whatever it might be. They themselves are still have one foot in that group, in that mindset that is, I want to belong. I want this group to accept me, to be pleased with me, to not reject me, because that's how I find some, maybe not all my safety now. Some of my safety feels in being a confident, strong individual that's got autonomy and control of my life. But a bunch of that also comes from, I want to belong to this group. I want to feel safe. You see this all the time. I mean, deconstructing Christians, a third of them still in church, very much happy because they want to belong on some level. And so I think it's interesting being aware of that tendency, that we still probably have a need to belong, to feel safe, to feel a part of this group. And that pushing us to have that conversation maybe a bit too early. Do you have thoughts on how to recognize when you're ready? I know that you kind of talked a bit about, figuring out that kind of balance of I've got space or
sure. Yeah, I think this is a really important distinction that you're making there, because there's no I don't think there's an easy answer to that. When do I have that conversation? When we talk about groups and how important they are to us, and I think from a Western perspective, we really prioritize, kind of the individual and personal autonomy, and that can function, well for some folks. At our core, we're social mammals, and we need each other, and so if we're thinking about leaving a group where we have some social connection and resources there, and we're not finding another group, another form of connection to kind of replace that or to take its place, that is going to be a really big disadvantage for us. That's going to be we're going to lose a protective factor potentially. And so that does put a survivor in a bit of a bind, right? Like, this group represents harm and things that aren't safe and okay for me, and they also represent some form of connection, and that is a resource for me. And when we think about what that does to a nervous system, we evolve to kind of move in the direction of caregivers, of comfort and support. When we're born, our brain isn't fully developed, our nervous system isn't fully developed. We're not able to self-regulate until we have the experience of co-regulating with another nervous system. And so it's central to our humanity. Like, we need each other, truly. And when that need for community and connection is exploited, or high demands are placed upon that, or there are consequences if you don't perform or do as expected within the group, then safety and connection is also a very risky thing, right? If I don't please the group, I'm not going to be safe here. I'll be rejected. And we can think about it through an evolutionary lens of how that functions within a group to maintain cohesion, but we can also see that through a nervous system lens of, like, that's a high price to pay for this connection. That's essential to your survival, but also maybe requiring you to live inside of a survival response. Not able to survive, but not able to feel safe. And so, how do we want to navigate that? Having these conversations too early, might be overwhelming. We're not ready for that. Not having the conversations at all may feel very disempowering and disconnected. And so there's no right answer to how to move forward. But again, focusing on what do you need to feel a bit safer, a bit stronger, a bit more connected within your current community, if that's the only option that you have, expanding those, potential resources to other humans, folks like in the deconstruction group that you have, in other, online communities, in-person communities, where you can begin to connect with other humans and get that same sense of, I'm heard, I'm seen, I'm understood, I'm a valid human. I think it really does point to why religious trauma is so challenging.
Right.
And this goes back to why developmental trauma is so challenging, more challenging for our nervous system in many ways than, really big single incident traumas. When a caregiver is a source of safety and support, as well as harm, neglect, abandonment, your nervous system doesn't know whether it moves toward or away, and it kind of freezes. You're just like, I don't have options. And, that becomes a very isolated, lonely, disconnected place. And to not have a foundation of safety and connection to go back to, you have to kind of build that from scratch, as it were. And if that sense of survival has only been attached to your religious beliefs about a God who you've discovered is maybe also a source of harm for you, then a person needs to do some work around, how do I reconceptualize my idea of God, or how do I feel safe and strong on my own in relationship with others. There are many options, many paths to go from there, but all of them are leading to a sense of safety and connection and strength, both within yourself and as part of your external connections and resources.
Yeah, gosh, there's so many directions we could go.
Yeah, I know, for sure.
I want to be aware, because we started a bit late, but I want to make sure.
Yeah,
how are you doing for time? Are you okay?
I'm okay for another half an hour. Yep. Okay,
perfect. Yeah, we'll make sure we wrap up by then. But great. Well, one of the things, there's a couple of things in here that I'm really fascinated by. One of them was someone talked about dealing with, you're talking there, but going through deconstruction is a very isolating program. Something like religious trauma is in some ways so unique because it has such far-reaching implications. It's not just my family, it's not just my workplace, it's not just my friend. It is it all just becomes this kind of one world that you suddenly lose. You lose all these friends, you lose all this stuff. And so I was talking about the kind of next level of that. They were talking about, I think they're a post-Mormon, but living in Utah, being a post-Mormon and having religious trauma. How do you go about dealing with being forced to live in places that are deeply triggering for you? So, for some people, they don't have to do this to that high degree, but maybe most of their friends are going to bring up, religious stuff, or they're going to pray, or, you're like, oh gosh, it's not just my family, it's my friends are doing it. Or you go to work and there's the one guy at work that's giving an altar call every week, and you're like, oh my God, this is so triggering for me, or whatever, or talking about hell, or whatever it might be. Or it might be that you live in Utah and you're like, Jesus, is there anywhere that's safe? You go to a coffee shop and they're playing worship music or whatever. It's just, there is no end. How do you recommend people go about living life when there is just, it seems every corner is this new trigger?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I live in Boise, Idaho, which, in some ways Idaho is like northern Utah in terms of the demographics of LDS believers here, and actually the majority of my in-person and local clients are former LDS as well. Oh, wow. And I think the Mormon experience is similar and yet unique when we think about the difference between belonging to an evangelical group versus being part of the LDS church. It tends to be just more pervasive, like it encompasses your entire
Right.
experience. I think you can find that in some evangelical groups as well. But I think Mormons do that better than maybe most
Yeah.
religious
They get the
groups.
community component down like big
Yes,
time.
yes, absolutely. And there really are amazing, sources of support and connection that come with strings attached, that feel very maybe warm and friendly and accepting, but also there's this underlying sense of, if you don't believe like us, then you're not okay. And here are the demands. And just the way shame and worthiness are kind of reinforced within that community. And if I was never part of the LDS church, but I certainly have learned a lot about that. How they kind of structure, even where they meet for worship in these different wards, and you're assigned, based upon your address, like where you go to church and when you go to church, what time. And so when you're in a really, heavily Mormon community, when you meet someone, there's a question of, which ward do you go to? There's all these, you're not just another human meeting, someone. You're like, I'm trying to figure out where I place you. And so as someone who was formerly part of the church, you have the experience of, I can't escape it. It really is everywhere. And I truly wish I had a really helpful, easy answer for that. I think each person's experience will be, unique to them. Focusing on how can I gain a sense of community connection support in some small way, whether that's online or finding your local group of Exmos, whatever that is for you to connect with. There is that need for community, that need for connection, a need to kind of share your experience with others. And so, yeah, I think, again, also, prioritizing your own sense of safety. How can you interact in such a way that you're not deferring, to your true believing Mormon friends and family. I actually I want to share this this exercises experience that came up recently in a therapy session, and I'm able to share this without disclosing any identifying information about the person. I actually have the permission to share because I've shared it with several other clients as well. I think what happens is when a person, a family member, a friend is disapproving of us, there's this kind of shame that they're wanting to kind of offload on us, and we're expected to kind of take it to, accept that. And so I would invite you to kind of visualize this if that's something you're comfortable doing, willing to do. And as you're listening, you can do this as well. Imagine that you're on this roller coaster. That's your life. It's a thrilling ride. It has its ups and downs. It has its challenges, but there's just a quality of like, I'm on this roller coaster. It's amazing. Like finally I'm free. Finally I'm doing what I want to do in my life. And you might just notice like maybe your hands are on your at times. You're just really enjoying this ride. And now I want you to think of someone in your life who represents, a friend or family member who's still part of the church, someone who is not okay with your deconstruction journey, who maybe doesn't understand your religious trauma. And as you're riding your roller coaster, I want you to look over to the side, down into the side, and maybe notice them sitting on a bench. And they're just shaking their head disapprovingly at you. Whew. Yeah. What does it feel like to see this? What do you notice about how shame is communicated forcefully, not without even words, just that shaking their head? And moments ago, you were on this amazing ride, and it was like, finally, I'm living my life the way I want to. This feels very important and connected and amazing. And now there's a sense of like, maybe your stomach kind of feels like it's dropping out. Maybe there's a tensing in your shoulders and chest. Maybe there's, some physiological response to that. We're going to go through the same exercise, but we're going to have a different way of looking at them in a moment. So now let's just setting aside the person on the bench, reconnecting to your roller coaster. Maybe there's this, turn you just went around. There's another kind of, thrilling part of the ride, and you're just really connected again. Like, okay, I'm here. This is my life. I'm doing what I want to do. This feels important and connected. And we're going to come around the corner again and have an opportunity to look over at that bench where your family member or friend is sitting. But this time, I want you to look with eyes of pity, not patronizing pity. And pity maybe isn't the word, with some compassion. I want you to look over at them with a quality, a felt sense of, I wish better for you. I just can't imagine that sitting on a bench, judging others disapprovingly, is the best version of your life. You know, if it is, I wish you the best with that, but I just can't imagine that it is. And whatever that is for you, I want better for you. I want you to have your own roller coaster. I don't want you to be riding my roller coaster. I'm not trying to sell you my roller coaster or convince you that you should ride a roller coaster like mine, but I want you to find the thing that works for you. I want that for you. And now notice as you look over and you see them shaking their head disapprovingly, and there's just this quality of like, I wish you well. I want better for you. I want you to know what I know about how life can be. And notice, where does that shame go? Where does that disapproval go? It's still going to have some impact for us, likely. We're still going to feel that. And there might be some sadness there. We might feel some loss, some disconnection. But if we can, you know, I think this taking the kind of high ground, as it were, you know, if you're in a predominantly Mormon community, you know, Mormons are not dissimilar to many other fundamentalist groups where their way is the right way and they know they're right. And you clearly aren't right. You're wrong. And so there's that kind of like, we do it better than you. We do life better than you. You know, we have the answers and you don't. And there's that I think that's a disapproval that we kind of sense from them. Is like, I'm better than you. They would never say that out loud, but that's communicated. You know, you're not living the best life because you don't believe what we believe. And instead of them celebrating, like, I'm proud of you for living life the way that works for you. Like, that looks like an amazing roller coaster. Like, go you, you know, maybe like, hey, waving, hey, good job, do you. We're getting that sense of disapproval from them. And so when you can move through the world from a place of, I don't want you to live a certain way to please me, and you don't have to live how I'm living. But whatever it is that works best for you, I would want that for you. Mm-hmm. Now we're modeling this kind of behavior that we might want to receive from them. You know, I tell folks a lot, like, if you're in this deconstruction mode and you're immersed in the conversations around, is this true or false? Is this right or wrong? Then you meet your true believing friends and you're like wanting to have that conversation. I think it can be helpful to say, yeah, independent of whether it's true or false or right or wrong, it doesn't work for me. Mm-hmm. And I can imagine that it still works for you, and go you know, do what works for you. Yeah. It doesn't work for me. It may or may not work for you, but that's not my place to decide. Changes that conversation. You're not having is this true or false or right or wrong? You're having I want you to do what works for you, and I hope you can, you know, offer me that, extend that same kind of generosity to me as well.
Yeah, that's so important. I think that we all run the risk of getting a bit fundamental about how not fundamental we are, and become the evangelist for you know, and trying to get people to change. And
I think this goes back to, and you know, everything that I do as a therapist, as a human who sees the world through the trauma lens, is really prioritizing a person's safety, their strength, their power, their connection, and kind of looking at it through that lens. You know, what I just described in that exercise, the ability to have compassion, understanding for another human, does assume some level of safety and strength yourself. Yeah. And so finding ways to connect more fully and in this embodied way to your roller coaster. This is my life. This is what I'm doing. These are my choices. And I feel very safe and strong and connected inside of them. That allows you to see the disapproving look without that, disrupting your sense of safety. And so, that may not be something a person's capable of doing if they're just trying to figure out, is this roller coaster safe for me yet or not? So kind of bearing that in mind.
Yeah, if you're not enjoying the roller coaster, you're not looking off to the side. You're like just gripping white knuckles.
Yes, for sure.
Absolutely. I wonder as well. We're barely getting through these questions, so I keep having thoughts based on what you're talking about. But I wonder. There's a component of integrating our past as well, and I think a lot of the times when working through deconstruction or even religious trauma stuff. There was some great questions, a couple of questions, I think, of people going, I'm struggling to validate my religious trauma because so much of my experience was good. I feel like there's this great need for people to be able to almost do that, to look upon someone that is in that fundamental place still and go, oh gosh, I feel sorry for you that you aren't maybe experiencing all that life could be for you. But I understand as well on some level. And maybe I look at my past self and go, oh gosh, I wish I could have had broken free of that. I wish I hadn't experienced that religious trauma, but also going, but I understand that so much of this was really helpful for me at the time. And it's what I needed. Maybe you came out of addiction, or you were in an abusive family, and actually going into a healthy, safe church that gave you community, that gave you love, that gave you affection, that gave you stability. Those are incredible things to develop in yourself, and then move on to become a bit more autonomous and a bit more, So I think, do you have thoughts on, or when you work with people that are going through religious trauma, like, how do you go about helping people integrate the good parts without rejecting the bad, or reject the bad without necessarily rejecting the good? Like, how do people go about that?
I think it's a very unique journey for each person. However, I think one of the things that can be helpful in that journey is to kind of set aside the notion that you have a true self. This is a very fundamentalist way of viewing oneself. Is like, well, I finally am living, I'm finally connected to my true self. Religion wasn't my true self, and now I am my true self. And there will be a tendency to kind of grasp onto this new thing and hold that tightly as well. If we look at our past experience inside of religion, and I guess I would caution folks to, this isn't about trying to, find all the redeeming qualities and how do I, take the things that were helpful for me and keep them and reject the rest. I mean, that certainly can be part of the process. However, looking at that through the lens of, how did that function for me then? And how might that function change in a different context? If we think about, an experience or a belief or a practice having inherent kind of qualities to it. If we say a chair is a chair, and this is what it is, this is what it does, this is what it looks like, and all of a sudden we have this image of like, this is a chair, and we believe that's what it is. And then we encounter a chair, when we're capsized in the ocean and it's floating, and it's like, well, the chairness of the chair is no longer important to us. Right. It's functioning as a flotation device, and I appreciate that it can have multiple functions depending on the context. Moving from a fundamentalist background where everything is inherent, everything is like, this is true, this is absolutely true, universally true in every context, it can be difficult to salvage things that may be functional now, but aren't super functional when we're holding tightly to them. And so I think starting from a place of I'm not, my sense of self isn't, self as content is kind of a term that we use to describe that. I am the summation of all the different roles that I occupy, the beliefs that I hold, the feelings that I experience. If I were to look at my life through that lens, I'd say, I'm a therapist, I'm a father, I'm, feeling a little bit anxious, and I would begin to identify, I'm a Christian, I'm a non-Christian. Like, these are these kind of like, this is who I am. I exist in these labels, these constructs, these ideas, self as content. If I were to expand out and say, maybe I'm self as process, I'm this ongoing process of change, this comports with what we know about the nature of the world, even our own physical being, regenerates cells at a fairly regular rate. And so we're not the same physical being. And to zoom out even further in self as context, this sense of I'm observing this ongoing process of change. If we think about these transitions that we go through as deconstruction, they're incredibly overwhelming if I'm attached firmly to this is who I am, and now I'm no longer that. Who am I? That does require kind of rebuilding a sense of self ongoing through that process. But what I would want to encourage folks is to recognize that rebuilding a sense of self, that ongoing process of change has been, they've been experiencing that over time. They've kind of pushed that into but I'm still a Christian and this is who I am. And they've tried to, really maybe just only focused on, self as content. But most of us don't have the same values we had when we were 5 years old. Most of us don't experience the same world, the world in the same way that we did when we were 16. Like this changes over time. So I think helping folks really connect with that, for that ongoing process of change, not to represent unsafety or dysregulation, but for that to represent potential. It is overwhelming. It can be overwhelming and full of potential at the same time. And how do we begin to connect with the potential? What direction do I want to move in? How can I connect more fully with the things that matter to me? That allows us to loosen our grip on this is how it has to be.
Yeah.
I think, no easy answer there, but maybe some principles to kind of incorporate into that process.
No, that's great. That's really, really interesting. I think about stuff all the time. I like thinking about stuff more from a kind of existential, kind of philosophical lens, just even looking at that and looking at stages of life and how we build ego and shrink ego and grow ego and all these different ideas and how much I mean, we're like people that are going through this going, I am this person. This is who I am. It's a physical, objective reality. Well, the second I change, I have some level of existential crisis on my hands, and then I finally piece it back together and go, good, okay, this is who I am. Good luck, right? I mean, how many minutes are you expecting to hold this one? It's truly, it's a lot. And I wonder, so part of me wonders, and this is something that came out, a couple of people asked me this question, and we were talking on my discussion group the other day, we discovered, so someone brought up the Myers-Briggs, and I've not looked at Myers-Briggs forever. I used to love it. And they were like, does anyone know what Myers-Briggs are? And like, we discovered of the 20 people that were chatting, about half of them were INFJs, which is the least common type. And we were like, that's weird. And then we were like, I wonder if there must be some, if that's genuinely the least common type. Actually, my wife is, my best friend is, I've got loads of friends that are INFJs, and I'm like, I reckon it's most common actually. Someone put the data in wrong somewhere. But we were like, is there some component of certain personalities? Now, I don't like the idea of personality as a fixed construct like we're talking about here. I think all these things can be very morpheus and change and whatever. But I do wonder if certain personalities maybe in that context are more likely to deconstruct and then more likely to join an online group to talk about it, whatever the specific niche is. Are there certain personality types that are more susceptible to religious trauma, some of the components of certain theologies, taking that on in unhealthy ways? Is there certain types of personalities that are more likely to uncover that or repress it or whatever? Do you have thoughts on that? Because I thought it was a really interesting question that someone had asked.
I think the research on personality is, obviously ongoing. And I think a lot of the, like Myers-Briggs and various kind of ways of identifying, this is the traits that I exhibit the most in the world. There's not a lot of, empirical evidence around that. If you take the Myers-Briggs, several times, you'll get, several different results. It's
massively fallen out of favor
so,
these days.
I like to look at those through the lens of if it's helpful and useful in terms of, here's how I view myself, and here's the kind of person you are, and this can be a structure in which we can understand each other more. Yeah, that could be very adaptive and functional. I think when it comes to maybe some of the big 5 personality traits that there is a bit more kind of empirical evidence around, I think the openness, this ability to be more open in the world, is I don't have evidence for this, but I think it's more likely to be connected to folks who are going through a deconstruction process. It takes a certain amount of willingness to be with uncertainty, to explore, to be curious, to be open in order to navigate that process. And so I think looking at it through the lens of, what is adaptive for the person in this context, and whether that's tied to, personality as we understand it or not. And again, that's not a fixed characteristic. And I'm super interested and intrigued with some of the research going on around psychedelics having a lasting effect on increasing openness. I think that may, which, there's anecdotal evidence for, that having the potential to be an antidote to fundamentalism. Like, I can't see the world in such a constricted black and white way anymore. There are more options, more possibilities, and I have to consider that. However, looking at that through the lens of trauma, narrowing the world, making it simpler, easier, having basic boxes to put things in, is a way of conserving energy that can be a source of that can be a really effective survival response.
Yeah.
And so I guess when we talk about, folks who are going through this deconstruction process, and maybe it's exciting, thrilling, like I'm learning new things and look at the world's expanding and isn't this amazing? Or even if it's not like to that degree of excitement, but it's like, it doesn't impact them as much. I think we looked at that and assessed for, how much autonomy do you have? How safe do you feel? How strong do you feel? At least from my perspective, it requires a certain level of safety to be curious. Curiosity is a really powerful force, and it can help us, to be okay with uncertainty and to explore and to expand our world. And yet, if my body is trying to survive a situation, if you're running from a predator, you don't care that there's really amazing flowers along the path, right? There's just like nothing matters but survival. And so I think it's important for us to acknowledge the certain level of safety that's required, which also might assume some level of privilege, which can then expand the conversation to, what are the social constructs around you? What are the systems that are impacting your overall sense of safety and well-being in the world? And how might that make it more difficult for you to be open and curious? And so ideally, we're creating conditions where it's possible to be open and curious. But that does, in my experience, that's very dependent upon our level of safety.
Yeah. Which makes so much sense. So much sense. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Brian, there's 110 things I'd love to go into, but let's wrap up. We'll do this again, I'm sure, at some point.
Awesome.
But tell me, so since we last talked, it's not been that long. It's only been a few months, actually, hasn't it? Was it December we talked, I think? Maybe November?
Think so, yeah, it was before the holidays,
so, But you and Laura have announced some stuff with the Religious Trauma Institute. You've got some new stuff going on. Do you want to talk a bit about what you're doing, how people can connect with you?
For sure.
Give them an update. Obviously, if people are like, "What? Who the heck is this guy?" We didn't really give much of an intro.
Oh yeah,
I'll record an intro before and say, "Go back and listen to the last episode first."
For sure.
But yeah, of course, people can check out your prior episodes, your Instagram, your Facebook for Room to Thrive, and roomtothrive.com for your practice, and Religious Trauma Institute at Instagram and Facebook, and religioustraumainstitute.com is the website. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
What's changing? What's happening?
Yeah. So last week we've been working on this project for a while, and we're finally able to introduce it. So we introduced the collaborative research group for religious trauma, and I think as of now, I think over 63 researchers and graduate students have joined the group, and more folks are, we hope to grow and expand the group. Our focus is to begin to to ask these questions in more kind of scientific and academic ways, looking at the clinical implications of that as well. And so I think part of our goal is to more clearly define what we're talking about as religious trauma, and to see that not as this amorphous syndrome or something that, tries to encompass all these different, maybe mental health disorders inside of one big umbrella, but to say, let's talk about religious trauma, as a stress-related disorder. Let's, talk about, maybe deconstruction. We could talk about that as maybe leading to religious trauma, resulting in religious trauma for some folks, but that could also result in an adjustment disorder. That could result in maybe some form of complex grief, anxiety, OCD. There's already kind of work around religious-based OCD and scrupulosity. And so our focus is really on the trauma piece, but we're also wanting to, kind of conceptualize it in a way that, the medical community, the scientific community, the mental health community can acknowledge and recognize religious trauma as a form of trauma, not as a separate, outside of the umbrella of complex PTSD and PTSD, but to see that as fitting underneath that. This is a context in which that trauma occurred. Here are some of the characteristics of that. And so I think a lot of our work within the research group, which I'm really excited to see a lot of folks already doing research around the edges of this, and and also beginning to gain more clarity around like what are these component factors that contribute to religious trauma. I think the adverse religious experiences construct that we've come up with will give us a framework to begin to understand, what do we know about power and control dynamics in religious setting? How do they tend to function? When these elements are high, what is the rate of trauma experienced by folks in these congregations? And we can begin to have some really good data around that. And I think that's going to be important for us moving forward. And so if a listener is a graduate student in a program interested in studying religious trauma, or part of a university lab who is, doing some research, or even, a research group that's unaffiliated. In fact, I wanted to invite you to be part of the group based on your research with the deconstruction community, because I think that fits in very nicely with the work we're doing. I would invite them to kind of apply to join the group. We are limiting it to folks who are kind of actively engaged in the research. And we're going to be introducing additional groups, a clinical consultation group, where that'll be open to mental health professionals around religious trauma. And as an organization, we're not primarily focused on providing direct support. We think there are other groups who are doing that fairly well, and we want to support that work. We're really wanting to increase this clinical knowledge and awareness of religious trauma. So we will be creating additional, resources for survivors, and all the work that we do is being informed by and centering the experience of religious trauma survivors. And we want their feedback and input and their ways for folks to get involved in doing that. But yeah, I'm just super excited about what all this represents.
Very
exciting. It's going to be huge.
Yeah. It's huge. And it's so important. It really is such important work. And I know there's different people kind of pushing some areas of this, but I know there's a lot of contention over who's doing what and how they present a lot of the stuff.
Sure.
So it's good to get a good group of academics that are in different areas, different fields, looking at this and creating some consensus and creating some good hard data, and hopefully educating and helping other clinicians. And I wanted to, just on that topic before we finish, I do want to ask, because I know we last time on the podcast, we talked a little bit about people looking to get help. Where are your go-to, if someone's listening to this going, gosh, I need to talk to a therapist, I need to speak to someone. Obviously, if they're in your state, they should immediately go to roomtothrive.com.
Yeah, of course,
but obviously, I don't think you're licensed to practice outside of states. That's how it works in America, is it?
Correct.
Right. So generally, is there a network that's actually helping people specifically going through some sort of religious trauma or coming out of religion? Because obviously, generally speaking, it's not a good idea to go to a Christian therapist. I would argue, generally speaking, it's not fair on the therapist or the person to be talking about these kind of things with that.
Sure, I think that really there's a lot of variables there. But in general, when I think about what do I prioritize in terms of looking for a therapist, I would want to prioritize a lot of skill working with trauma, and in my own personal kind of bias and perspective is coming from a more embodied place. And so, somatic experiencing and various forms of more embodied approaches to trauma, I think there's just a lot of value in that. However, other forms of trauma treatment are effective. And so that would kind of depend on the client, what type of support they're looking for.
Sure.
And so that being like the most important thing to me, if you have, it's possible if you have a Christian therapist who you feel safe enough with. Again, this is whether or not therapy is effective for survivors is primarily dependent upon that therapeutic relationship and feeling safe in that. And you're focusing a lot on the somatic experience of trauma as opposed to the cognitive story of trauma.
Right.
You could probably do some pretty effective work with a Christian or a non-Christian therapist who has is coming from an embodied perspective and understands trauma, because the details of the situation and the context and the experience are not as essential.
You're not pushing them into their existential crisis.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And so I would kind of start there. There is the Reclamation Collective is developing a directory for therapists who have some familiarity with religious trauma. We're partnering with them, and one of the projects that I'm working on with a graduate student at the moment, a practicum student who's doing a rotation with me, we're developing an online course platform, live trainings as well as recorded trainings that will provide therapists who already have a working knowledge of trauma and experience and training working with trauma, giving them, the extra kind of awareness and insight into the experience of religious trauma. And then that would, when therapists are part of this, the Reclamation Collective's directory, clients can feel a bit more confident that they at least understand and acknowledge and validate religious trauma as an experience. And so, I think a lot of these things are very new. You can, on the resource page of my website, I have several other trauma-based directories that people can look at. The Reclamation Collective's directory is there as well. And then just, kind of general psychology today, and with the disclaimer that, obviously there's no kind of claim being made that these folks understand religious trauma. But then, we're also creating resources as part of Religious Trauma Institute to for clients to give their therapist. I hear this all the time from clients saying, I'm spending, weeks and weeks and months sometimes educating my therapist about what it was like growing up inside of purity culture and fundamentalist kind of religious context, so that they are able to help me more effectively.
Right.
And
they're paying an hourly rate to do so.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And I think as a therapist myself, I'm like, I that's my work to do. I need to educate myself. And so, we're certainly creating resources to make that easier for therapists to get up to speed so they can be more effective with clients. Yeah.
It's wonderful. Brian, I really, really appreciate the work you do. Honestly, I think you're so essential. And what you and Laura are doing and this new initiative that you guys are kind of like undertaking is just so exciting. I've been meaning to message you about stuff, because we're going to do one of the first studies of the two studies we're doing this year is going to be a wellness study, and we want to look at the wellness of people that are coming out of church, deconstructing, whatever, and try and correlate like how what that looks like. What's your wellness based on how we can then map that based on how long you've been out of church, because we all know that people's wellness plummets when they leave church. But that's a well-known statistic that's been again and again and again proved. But I'm intrigued to see what does that look like if we map it with some other things of how spiritually mature and whatever else that might be. So,
when I hear you say that, I have a bit of a visceral response to that because I think that can be used against folks who are deconstructing.
Hugely.
Church is essential for your well-being, and it's like, no, human connection is essential to your well-being. And I think in the ex-church communities, we need to do better about creating safer spaces, which is obviously massively more difficult given that a lot of religious trauma happens in interpersonal and community spaces, making it difficult to trust communities and connect outside of that. But
and
yeah,
personal intuition in the church. We're not aware of our trauma. We bury it. We don't acknowledge our mental health issues. We don't acknowledge any of this stuff because we're told, no, you don't have that problem. You've got Jesus. And when you come out, you start introspecting and you go, holy crap, there's loads of stuff here. That's not new, most of it. You know?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, the awareness is new.
So it'd be great to talk to you because I'd love to include some scales and metrics, maybe some sort of trauma scale in there would be fascinating.
Yeah, and actually that's one of the things we're working on as well within the group. And there are some spiritual abuse scales and additional kind of spiritual struggle scales, which are really fascinating as it connects to psychological flexibility and so forth. So I think
we should talk offline about this for sure.
Yes, we're on.
Any way I can help you, of course, because I've got a group of 3,000 people that are keen to do studies, so that's of course a resource that it would be great for you guys to tap into, I'm sure. Awesome. Brian, thank you for your time, for your insight, for your wisdom, for the compassion that you give that insight in as well. It's profound and it is really helpful. It blesses me so much. Very Christian word there. It really does. It really does.
That mean a lot to me, and I certainly am encouraged to see the work that you're doing as well. And it means a lot to see folks who are taking this seriously. It's a very isolating and lonely kind of experience for folks to go through. And when it feels like, is this normal? Am I okay? Like what is this that I'm going through? And just to have some data around that, some other people researching that is so important and valuable.
We live in a good time, a good time.
Yeah, we do.
People can just Google and go, oh, this is what it is. Like, I would hate to have done this 40 years ago or something. Yeah. And so, absolutely. All right. Well, I love you, man. Awesome. I'll let you. I think this is going to come out tomorrow. I'm going to literally boom out because I've just not been on top of getting recorded. So you're literally the next one I'm recording, and I'm planning on releasing something tomorrow. So
okay, sounds good.
But I'll let you know.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, great. All right. Love you, man. Catch you later.
Take care. So long. Bye-bye.